Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining our webinar. We'll get started in just a couple minutes as everyone who has registered signs in. And once again, good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for joining the webinar today. We will get started in just a moment. You will see a poll on your screen that's popped up. Please submit your answers if you feel so inclined. We will produce the results of the polling questions after the webinar. And we'll get started in just a couple minutes. Okay, a couple minutes past the hour. Thank you all for joining. My name is Austin Monserrat, and I'm excited to welcome you all to today's webinar on the anatomy of a DDQ. A few quick housekeeping notes. We'll keep this discussion as close to an hour as possible. And feel free to utilize Zoom's question and answer feature to send in questions throughout the discussion. We will address throughout the call and towards the end of the call, the end of the webinar as well. Keep in mind this discussion is not for press attribution. And if you see now there's a poll pop-up screen, please participate, and we will share the results in the post-webinar takeaways. We'll send to all registrants and attendees. For those of you unfamiliar with DiligenceVault, we're so glad to have you today. We are a two-sided digital diligence technology that facilitates more effective due diligence and manager research, information exchange between investors and their asset managers. Like everything we do, today's webinar is meant to be collaborative between DiligenceVault, the members of our ecosystem, and the broader investment community. If you'd like to learn more about us, please reach out to us. We'd love to chat. We can set up a demo of our technology. Email us at ask@diligencevault.com. Okay, now I'm happy to introduce Maura Harris from Bostwick Capital, who will be moderating our panel and leading the conversation forward. Maura, over to you. Maura, you might be muted there.
Thank you. Thank you, Austin, and thank you for inviting me to moderate this panel today. As Austin said, I am Maura Harris. I'm the head of operational due diligence at Bostwick Capital. Bostwick Capital is a fund of funds manager based in New York. Our strategy is a concentrated strategy focused on investing in hedge fund managers trading in the equity markets. We are super excited this year. We are celebrating our 15th anniversary. In addition, for the past several years, I've also been advising people and businesses in transformation. I am an advisor at HAP. HAP is an organization that helps people navigate disruptions in their career and remain relevant. In addition, I'm also an advisor at Symphonic Leadership Partners. Symphonic is a platform of multifunctional senior executives providing change management to businesses. With their focus on transformation in talent, digital, ESG, they're partnering businesses to design and execute change for future success. Neil, I'll hand it over to James, actually.
Hi, good morning. My name is James Coe. I am a portfolio manager for Arizona PSPRS. Arizona PSPRS is a $13 billion public pension plan. Beneficiaries include public safety employees, corrections officers, as well as elected officials for the state of Arizona. And I am the portfolio manager for both our diversifying strategies portfolio, as well as our contractual income portfolio.
Neil?
Great. Thank you so much, Maura, and thank you for DiligenceVault for allowing me to be here. It's a pleasure and looking forward to speaking with the group. My name is Neil Prunier. I'm the Director of Standards and Best Practices at ILPA. And as my title suggests, I focus on the variety of standards and best practices that we have out in the industry today, while constantly evaluating opportunities for us to put new standards and best practices into the private markets industry. These include materials such as the fee and reporting template, the capital calls template, as well as our due diligence questionnaire, which we're actually underway of performing a refresh on right now. Just to speak about ILPA for a moment, we're the only global organization dedicated exclusively to advancing the interest of LPs and their beneficiaries. We like to say for LPs by LPs. We focus in three main areas, and that's education, events, and empowering. And we carry out the empowering through standards, best practices, and advocacy work. We're a 550 plus member organization with over 5,000 active individuals. And our members represent over 2 trillion AUM in the private equity space, which is roughly 50% of the global institutional private equity investment space. And our members are based 70% in North America, roughly 20% in Europe, and then the rest split across Asia Pacific, Middle East, and the rest of the world. Historically, we were more known as a public pension plan organization, but this has actually changed dramatically over the last several years, where we have great coverage across endowments, foundations, private pensions, family offices, sovereign wealth funds, and insurance companies.
Great. All right, let's get started. As many of us know, DDQs have become standard practice for both buy side and sell side people in the market. Their purpose is either to send or receive desired information, and if they're used properly, they're going to provide transparency into an organization, identify potential risks, normalize information, highlight exceptions, changes, and events, or ask for something else that is of interest to you. That said, though, developing the DDQ content, establishing the process for using DDQs, and digesting the information from DDQs are critical for optimizing the value of a DDQ. So let's begin with understanding how they're used in the market. And I'm going to start with James. Can you give us an overview of Arizona PSPRS and how they use questionnaires in their due diligence program?
Yeah, absolutely. And just to provide a little context here, I can give an overview in regards to the investment due diligence and how DDQs help bolster that investment due diligence process. So there are multiple phases in our investment due diligence process. And once we have identified and performed work around the strategy and sector that looks promising for the trust, we build an expected risk as well as an expected return framework. From there, along the way, we identify key managers in the respected space. And once we hone in on a specific potential investment partner or multiple potential investment partners, we will produce as well as distribute the due diligence questionnaire. We use the due diligence questionnaire to review the structure of the organization, the strategy, the risk process, key terms, and compliance in regards to best practices, and review key metrics that are important to various people from our organization. The goal of the DDQ is to build transparency as well as confidence to decide whether or not to move forward with a potential investment.
Great, thank you. Neil, as you come from ILPA and come from a standardized approach in DDQs, maybe you can give us a sense of how investors are looking to ILPA for guidance in their DDQs, and you know, what's your view on standard DDQs in the market? What's the benefit that they play for investors and asset managers?
Sure, happy to. And you know, specifically when we think about the private equity space and the DDQ in mind, and this idea of standardized questionnaires, you know, we've seen the level of detail required for the upfront due diligence process just grow astronomically over the last several years. This in turn then naturally leads to an increase in lengthy, customized DDQs by LPs, consulting or OCIO firms, and placement agents. These DDQ ask different questions or sometimes similar questions with just slightly different wording that requires unique responses and additional time completing the request. This really creates an extreme burden on all parties involved and takes away from even more value add space. So, you know, don't get me wrong, the DDQ is an extraordinarily important document and part of the process. I've been working on a project to revamp our DDQ for a period of time now. I'm passionate about due diligence and the document itself. But when you think about it, there's very limited secret sauce in the DDQ itself. You know, you really don't have LPs point to a question or two and say, you know what, that's why we're top quartile investors. It's more about interpreting and digesting answers as one part of your overall due diligence process. So having a standardized document creates a more efficient process, eliminating unnecessary friction in the process of sharing information with LPs. This in turn then allows for more time to be spent on generating even more transparency and analyzing results from the broader due diligence process. When we think about the DDQ and to make an impact with standardization, adoption is key. We see investors using the DDQ document as their standard document for this process in the private equity space. The current DDQ is actually the most downloaded document on the ILPA website. But when I think about adoption, it isn't a zero-sum game. It's not you either use the ILPA questionnaire in full and only those questions, or you don't use it at all. We recognize that investors have unique questions that they need to ask for very good reasons as part of their process. That's fine. Our view is that the ILPA DDQ should cover about 80 to 90% of your DDQ focus, and then you can add additional questions that are relevant for you as an investor. That way, answering the main components can be standardized and carried out more efficiently, and you can get insight into the areas that are particularly of interest to you as an investor.
Great, super helpful. And so I think the benefit you just indicated there was the speed of answering and the consistency of answering, and on the back end, how you digest that information is important. And I think that all goes into how we construct a DDQ. The ILPA DDQs, the AIMA DDQs, all the industry standard DDQs really are a resource for us to construct what we need going forward. And I'm going to flip it back to James. And James, maybe you can just give us a little preview on how you guys are constructing your questionnaires, what resources are available to you.
Yeah. Maybe I can give a little perspective from both the hedge fund perspective, which is quasi-liquid type of investment vehicles, as well as a contractual income private lending, which is more of an illiquid vehicle perspective. As we all know, there's multiple resources that are out there. And I'm very thankful in regards to organizations like ILPA, who is a wonderful resource, especially on the illiquid side. There's also organizations like AIMA, as you discussed, Maura, or MFA, who focuses more on more liquid type of investment vehicles. And at the same time, the trust as well as the investment staff work with several consultants. We're mindful that of the questions in the IDD as well as the ODD process for our consultants, and we want to minimize redundancies when we construct our DDQs. The trust, most importantly, the trust has also hired a very experienced investment staff who have deep knowledge in investing in both public as well as private investments. And I think that at the end of the day is a super valuable resource when both constructing the DDQ as well as reviewing the questionnaires.
Great. You know, we actually just got a question from the audience, and I'm just going to put it to Neil. Neil, how much are any of you seeing in the alteration of DDQs to include ESG elements regarding managers?
Sure. ESG is a very popular talking point right now, and it's a very popular element of the investment process in general. And it's something that ILPA is going to be getting even more involved in when we think about 2021 and beyond. But ESG, therefore, is very much covered in DDQs. The ESG component of the ILPA DDQ currently is built on the PRI responsible investment DDQ for LPs. And that's a trend that's going to continue when we think about the DDQ that's coming out in 2021. But there are definitely elements of the ESG space that are not fully covered in the current questions in the DDQ. So we do see a number of LPs that have started to adjust their questions in the space to be even more comprehensive. Historically, Europe, especially when we think about the E side of things, has been further ahead of the US, and as such has been asking questions in a more detailed fashion for an extended period of time. We are seeing the US come up in a very rapid rate, and the US has actually been leading on the S side of things. So we do see increases there. So we do anticipate making improvements to this space in our upcoming DDQ because of the proliferation of ad hoc ESG questions that have come up in the market because of how popular and how relevant ESG is in the investment process decision-making today.
James, on the ESG front, have you tailored your DDQs at all for ESG?
That is in discussion. As far as a customized DDQ that's focused on the ESG front, that is something that's in the work.
Yeah, great. And actually, let's keep on these questions. They're starting to come in, which is a great thing. There is a question here, and I'm going to ask James the question. Is there a section of your DDQ devoted to managers or their service providers using third-party systems, portals, or hosted cloud-based products that may host confidential portfolio or investor details?
Sure. Or go ahead, James.
Oh, no, please, Neil.
Okay, I can say right now this is a blind spot on the ILPA DDQ and something that we recognize that needs to be enhanced. I think this speaks to some of the themes of cybersecurity as well as operational due diligence. And so those are two elements that we recognize need to be enhanced in the DDQ because these specific pieces are not covered to the degree that they should. A lot of investors are very interested in what type of third parties you're using and what type of valuation that has gone into those. What are they beholden to from a security standpoint? What type of tests have they passed to ensure the security and the quality of the information?
So is it fair to say ILPA is evolving in this space?
Correct.
And maybe you could just chat about ILPA with how they collaborate with other organizations in developing content that may be more experts in this space.
Sure, happy to. So when we think about the standards and best practices space at ILPA, there's really three themes that reign true across everything that we do, and that's transparency, governance, and alignment of interest. That's at the heart of everything that we put together. So when we first started the project of refreshing the DDQ, these themes were directly in mind. To take a step back, the DDQ was first released in 2013 and subsequently updated in 2016 and 2018 to cover ESG and DE&I respectively. So holistically, it has been some time since a refresh. When we wanted to take the first steps to identifying how to update our DDQ, we first did a comparison of our current document with our Principles 3.0 document that was released in 2019 to see where there were areas covered in our principles that were not covered in the DDQ. We also then reviewed other work that ILPA has done For example, subline guidance that was initially released in 2017 and then again updated last year, as well as more recently, our significant work that has taken place with the Diversity in Action Initiative. So this gives us other groundwork of areas that we know need to be enhanced in our materials. We then explore other developments in the market and what our members are telling us. So we actually have a program here at ILPA called LP Insights, where members of our team internally carry out calls with individuals at member organizations. So for example, in 2020, we carried out over 2,000 such calls. So we've identified a number of areas where we need to enhance the materials through this, such as, I mentioned this before, but cybersecurity, as well as some more operational due diligence items, as well as different things related to COVID-19 current events, whether you think about political contributions or SPACs and how much that's in the news. So when we think about this as a project in full, talked about some of the internal evaluation that we do, a key element of all of our projects is to solicit feedback and expert insight into a lead up for a public comment period. So while we're here for LPs and by LPs, we do want to make sure that we're talking to all sides of the industry to test our understanding and push our development even further. So this involves talking with LPs, GPs, placement agents, consulting OCIO firms, and peer associations, such as PRI, as I mentioned before, to see where we can learn more from subject matter experts, because that's really important to have their perspective when we're thinking about building out. One other point that I'll make is that we also recognize that realistically, there's such a thing as too long or too comprehensive of a DDQ. At times, this work can be a bit like Goldilocks, not too hot, not too cold, not too long, not too short. So we can't just add everything. We need to be purposeful in what we add. And that's why it's so important that we do connect frequently with our industry peers across all sides of the ecosystem.
And maybe we can give a little perspective on, as we're developing content for the DDQs and collaborating across the industry. What is your perspective on changing questions, changing the objective of some sections of your DDQ? Like you said, too much, too little. We're continuously learning. How often is too often to change your DDQ? But what is the right space where you should sit down and really look at the content and make sure it's still relevant and you're still asking the right questions, you're not asking too many questions that are no longer relevant. Maybe Emil, you want to take that, and
sure.
I'd love to get your thoughts as well.
Sure, I'm happy to jump in. And again, I think this is a lot like Goldilocks. The idea of you don't want it to be too soon, where the DDQ is changing every 6 months, but you also don't want it to be too late, where it's been 8-10 years between DDQ updates and a lot has changed in the market that is no longer getting captured. So how are we handling this? As I mentioned, staying in touch with the market and industry news on a daily basis, the LPI calls that I mentioned. Internally, we also have a reporting standards advisory council and an industry affairs committee that helps us stay really connected and rooted to what's going on in the industry and helps us talk about, all right, where are we seeing a proliferation of ad hoc one-off questions come up? And where does that speak to, all right, ILPA probably should get involved here and be able to help standardize this, because it's now getting asked by a lot of LPs in many different ways, and we've reintroduced a level of customization that didn't exist a few years ago because this wasn't a relevant topic. So I don't have a precise answer that says, hey, every 12 months we aim to update our DDQ, but that this is something that we want to stay really closely connected to and identify opportunities where it does make sense to update, given the amount of changes that happen in this industry and the need to make sure that the needs of investors are being met through questions in the DDQ.
That's great, thank you. And actually, James, I'm going to shift it over to you, but just a little bit differently with a question that came in from the audience. One of the questions that came in was, what has been the manager response rate with sending custom versus standard questionnaires? Do you see response rates differ? I'm going to just change that a little bit, because you only have one perspective, and that's your perspective right now. Maybe can you give us some color as to the success rate of of your DDQ being answered in the market? And do you find that those DDQs are answered completely, or are there questions that people just avoid answering? And how do you handle that?
Yeah, back to our multiple phases from a investment due diligence process. Typically, when we get to the due diligence phase, there's a good amount of work spent on the strategy, the industry, as well as spending time with that potential investment partner. So in terms of answering the DDQ questions or sending the DDQ questions out to that potential investment partner and getting a response back, that's close to 100% of the questions being answered. As far as all the questions being answered or questions that are left blank or not available answers, I think that's more of a case by case, and it depends on the specific investment partner. In our review process for items which we believe are pertinent, if those items are left blank, if there are appendixes that are not completed, for example, portfolio metric, let's say structure, organization, employee turnover, carry on the private investment side, we will follow up and try to complete the questionnaire with a comprehensive answer or an answer that's that feels more complete.
Great. Great. I think we should kind of shift over a little bit just in the, and talk about more around the process of sourcing information on DDQs. And so let's, you know, James, maybe you can give us some color on your on how you send DDQs to the market, both upfront initially, but before an investment, and what you're doing on monitoring on the back end.
Yeah, so on the distribution of the DDQ, we work with DiligenceVault, as you're familiar with. And DiligenceVault serves as a central repository with our DDQs. And DiligenceVault helps in regards to automate workflow and monitor research activities. In terms of DDQ preparation, DDQ distribution, DiligenceVault is utilized to send as a medium to send to our investment partners or potential investment partners, and that potential investment partner will utilize Diligence to fill out the DDQ and send back to us. Once the DDQ is sent back, the team will then review and discuss whole meetings of key points of answers that are industry standards, are not industry standards, and we'll flag items that, if the items are flagged, what is the best approach to use to best follow up, gain clarity on certain type of items or issues, and decide, is this a green light? Is this an orange light to move on to the next phase of that investment due diligence process?
Great. And so when your DDQs are constructed, are you collaborating across many within your organization, and to kind of pull in, you know, what are, you know, besides the investment and the ODD teams, what is your board looking for? What other stakeholders that may exist within your organization? What are key elements that you need to know for their needs? Are you kind of looking at it holistically across all stakeholders and creating that big initial questionnaire, or are you kind of carving out and going to your managers separately based on the stakeholder need?
It's a collaborative process. The DDQ is also an evolving process as well too. It's reviewed every 6 months. Speaking specifically, let's say on the liquid side or the hedge fund side, And as the process evolves of questions, of common questions that may come up in our investment due diligence process, we want to incorporate those questions upfront in the DDQ. For example, let's say if in the legal process, a question that pops up is whether or not the potential investment partner has directors and officers insurance. What is that coverage amount? As opposed to waiting for further along in the process to cover those type of topics. Mm-hmm. The DDQ is wonderful in terms of addressing that upfront, as well as so many other topics that are part of the day-to-day in terms of working with different members of the team.
Great. And a question just came in, James, specific for you. With regards to structuring your questions and using DiligenceVault, are you using more multiple choice, yes, no, text-driven, free-form type structures in sourcing information from your managers?
Oh, there's a whole litany of both multiple choice as well as fill in the blank type of questions.
Okay, and that's great. And so maybe could you speak to the value of structuring questions and what a yes/no response could be, the value of a yes/no response could be versus just having a free form?
Yeah, there are some questions that yes/no is very appropriate, and from a being mindful of time and process, the yes/no works perfectly fine. Let's say if for example, if the organization's registered was XYZ organization, for example, those work fantastic. Let's say when we look at questions such as a potential employee turnover, or has there been legal proceedings, that requires a lot more nuance and a lot more qualitative follow-up than just a yes/no type of approach.
So it seems
like... Other thing I jump in and add there, because I know on the ILPA DDQ, for example, there's a basic question section and an advanced question section, and the basic questions are yes/nos. One of the benefits that you can also do there is comparing a set of GPs across each other relatively easily to see where the answer is yes, where the answer is no, what stands out as an outlier in that. Then you can also compare it relative to previous funds very easily, as far as it was previously yes, now it's no, what's happened there. And it gives you an easier indication and ability to dive into it versus some of the open-ended questions that can get rather lengthy in responses. Qualitative context is so important to this process, but at times it makes it more difficult and challenging to compare it relative to other GPs or previous funds from a particular GP.
Great. So I think, the answer there is that it helps you identify the exceptions and focus on the exceptions, which are not necessarily a bad thing. It could be a forward-thinking, discussion. And actually, James, back to you. We got another relevant question. Let me just scroll down a little bit. With what frequency do you revisit diligence information for either enhancement or slippage throughout the life of the investment? And on what information do you request updates? Basically, what is your monitoring for, what changes from that initial due diligence questionnaire?
Yeah, I think a properly set up DDQ should not require updates or significant changes, I'm sorry, a properly set up DDQ in terms of the answers that are, in terms of the responses that are received back. Those questions and answers should not change, or I do not expect it to change every 12 months or 18-month period. And let's categorize quasi-liquid investments, for example, hedge funds, and let's look at illiquid investments, for example, private lending. For private lending, let's say if we decide to re-up on the investment, was the investment partner, that re-underwriting will take place every 2.5 or every 3.5 years. And the DDQ will be sent to that potential investment partner. On the hedge fund side, a well-constructed DDQ and the answers that are received in that initial underwriting process, I do not expect for it to change every 18 months or so. However, if there are changes, that is part of our quarterly, if not monthly review calls and meetings. It could be changes as it relates to team members. It could be changes as it relates to, let's say, slight nuances. What was the structure? And those information and those type of details will come out during our quarterly, if not monthly, type of calls.
Great. Hey, and Neil, with regards to ILPA, what's their position on monitoring, and do they have any kind of template or anything with regards to what is the right questions that should be asked periodically, you know, whether it's around changes, events, and so forth?
Sure, and that's a great question and timely, because it was actually a consideration this year as a potential project to pick up. Was the idea of creating a template to be used for ongoing monitoring. It is not something that we currently have at ILPA directly. I do know a number of our members use our initial due diligence questionnaire as their backbone of a ongoing monitoring set of questions to stay in tune with the manager and to be able to check for any changes that have come up. So we don't have that yet today, but that is on the list as far as a potential future project. One thing to note here, and why I do think it's so important, is because a lot of times I think monitoring focuses on relevant information like, you know, performance updates, portfolio company information, but then there's other changes that you really want to be aware of. For example, if a GP changes their auditing firm, okay, that's probably going to bring some questions up. Perhaps it's less of an issue if it's going from one Big Four to another Big Four, but if you're all of a sudden changing your auditor from one of the Big Fours to a firm that not many people have heard about, that's going to raise a lot of questions. And that's not always self-reported. And so it's important to be able to understand what are the questions that are important for you on an annual basis or on a set frequency, and how can you interact with your GP to get updates to that, because a lot of this information isn't necessarily automatically included in annual updates or ongoing reporting materials that the GP provides.
Great, thank you. All right, and so moving on. All right, so I think we have about 5 minutes left, 7 minutes left. Let's just talk quickly about digestion before we get to the rest of the questions. There are a few more questions coming in, and let's, if you have any questions, please start sending them in. Our last 10-15 minutes will be spent on Q&A. I think we'll spend the next 5-7 minutes on just how we are digesting the information that we are getting from the DDQ. That's the ultimate reason for these DDQs, is to source the information and optimize and utilize the information internally. So let's take this over to James. James, could you give us a sense of when these questionnaires come back, and they are quite extensive, where is that information going? Who uses that information, and how is it evaluated within your firm?
Yeah, on the digestion part, so the information is sent back to us via DiligenceVault. Once the information is in DiligenceVault, it will be distributed to key members who cover a specific asset class. For example, if it falls under the diversifying strategies asset class, our team here will review the DDQ. In that review process, we will flag items that are standard, if not standard, to industry norms, as well as whether or not the responses are are in line with best practice in specific type of topics and forms. At the end of the day, the assessment of the DDQ is to decide, do we move forward? Do we not move forward? And let's say in situations where orange lights do appear with the questions that are answered, we want to gain, and we need to gain more comprehensive detail in regards to why is this a no, or why is this a yes? And why is this not in line to expectations? And that requires an exercise beyond just the information gathering, the DDQ phase of the underwriting process.
Great. And Neil, any thoughts on your end with, how firms should take the ILPA information and utilize it within their organizations?
Sure. And so the information contained in the DDQ, as James has talked through, is absolutely critical to the due diligence process. And it's important to note that it is just one element of the due diligence process. The DDQ does not make the full evaluation process. There's different components of it. But when you think about the information, one of the reasons why platforms such as DiligenceVault is so powerful is the ability to store the information and then easily compare it from one side to the other. ILPA has not historically been a technology firm. So we're putting out these public materials to make use of these standardized questions. And that's where, again, a firm like DiligenceVault being able to input the ILPA questionnaire into their platform is extraordinarily beneficial to investors, because it allows them to store the information more systematically and review it and compare it more easily, create different grading against it. So you can highlight, as James mentioned, what's market's norm, what's not, what is concerning, what is not, whatever is the most relevant for you as an organization. So really, it's about being able to analyze the information, identify what are the most important elements for you as far as red flags, yellow flags, and what you need to dive into even further as part of your evaluation process, whether that's in in-person meetings or whether that's in reference checks, to be able to get to the bottom to alleviate those concerns for, especially in the private equity industry, where you're going to be entering into a 10, 11, 12, potentially longer year relationship with the GPs. You want to make sure that you've done your analysis and feel comfortable with all the different questions that you have come up.
Great, great. All right, let's shift over. We've got a handful of questions here, and I want to make sure we get most of them in. And I'm going to, Neil, going to you. You're in a position to read many DDQs across the industry and collaborate with many. What do you think are some of the weakest parts of the current DDQs in the market? And what is your recommendation on how managers can answer some questions to position themselves better than maybe others in the market?
Sure. I think at a high level, one of the things that I see and can be a challenge is when managers kind of cherry pick their DDQ and include the sections questions that will look very positive about their organization and their funds, and then leave out questions that are not as positive. So for example, we've seen a really big push in the DE&I space. And that's a question that if it's not included in a GP's internal DDQ, LPs are going to be reaching out to ask about it. So it's beneficial to include that from the get-go. And if you aren't where you want to be and where you should be as an organization, being able to provide qualitative updates about where you are, what your plans are to adjust this, how you're going to handle the situation is really meaningful and shows that you as a GP are owning it rather than not including anything and then answering it when LPs ask about it, but not fully kind of leaning into it as much. So I think it's important for GPs to be able to recognize that if they're not including a section, LPs probably have a sense of why, but it's important that they are able to speak to not just their strengths, but speak to other areas. And qualitative information there is really helpful to provide context and color into where progress needs to be made and how progress is intended to be made.
Great, great. So Okay, and you know, with regard, James, with regards to the questionnaires that you know come back to you, does a manager or a GP ever think about just try to send you their own proprietary DDQ, whether it's an ILPA or AMA DDQ, and say, here are the information, you'll find it within, or is it they must have answered your proprietary DDQ?
Yeah, no, the review of the investment partner's DDQ is usually done beforehand or in conjunction with sending out our DDQ. And just as they understand that we have put a lot of time, care, and effort in reviewing the potential investment opportunity, we have not really received too much pushbacks in regards to filling out our DDQ.
Do you find that managers or GPs may have issues with, you know, may misunderstand the question that you're asking, and they may not answer it correctly, or maybe they're having, you mentioned you used DiligenceVault, they may not answer the question as you thought they should have. Do you find a lot of disconnect there by how the GP manager interprets the question based on what you're looking to achieve?
I think the ones and most who read the questions carefully, if there are situations like that that arise, they are proactive in terms of reaching out and clarifying specific questions. And at the same time, when we do our review process, and if we do see something that's NA or unsatisfactory, it's reciprocated in terms of reaching out to gain further clarification as well, especially for key items that the investment team feels is important as part of the process.
Great, great. Neil, where do you think the future lies in DDQs? Where do you, if you could say what your dream DDQ would be, maybe you can give us a snapshot of a DDQ in 2 to 3 years.
Sure. I mean, I think a lot of this is more about adoption. So the document itself, as mentioned before, is very important, but I think as an industry, especially again in the private equity space, there's progress to be made in the document and improving it, but there's even more progress to be made as far as adoption to help recognize the benefits of efficiencies, to help reduce some of the unnecessary friction that exists at times between sharing information of LPs and GPs. The more time that is spent on ad hoc custom DDQs, the less time that's spent on completing even more in-depth ESG or DE&I or other portfolio company deep dives. And so it's really important for the industry to take a step back and say, what's most important to us? And this is on both sides, LPs and GPs. Where are we willing to give and where are we willing to get? And how do we need to work together? So for me, in 2 to 3 years, in the private equity space, a huge progress point would be seeing even greater adoption of a standard DDQ, of the ILPA standard DDQ, to help recognize the efficiencies that standardization can create, and to allow for more time to be spent on even more value-added data sharing and data analysis.
James, how do you see your DDQ evolving in the next couple of years?
Yeah, I think back to 2 words that are constant themes in terms of the objective of the DDQ. One is transparency, and second is building confidence in terms of the collected data from the questionnaires to move along the process. As far as looking out into several years away from today, I think some of the areas that I expect to see more standardization as well as a stronger customized resources would be along the areas of separately managed accounts as well as co-investments, which are becoming more of a focus for institutional investors.
Great. And if I could just give my perspective as well, as the world is shifting to more of a digital space, collaboration is really really going to go full steam ahead. And I think, a lot of the struggles of the DDQ on both sides of the table is probably because of a lack of understanding. And I think the more we can collaborate with what we're looking for, the better the GPs and the managers will be able to answer the questions with what we're looking for. I think if there's a huge collaboration leads to education and will help smooth out this process, which has become onerous for many in the industry. I have a handful more questions. Let me see. If there's anything, I think a lot of these can be answered in the follow-up that will come out from DiligenceVault post this webinar. But if there's no more questions, Austin, I think we can transition it back to you.
Yeah, that sounds great. Neil, James, were there any questions that you see in the Q&A bank there that you would like to answer that haven't been?
One thing that I'd say, and you talked before about interacting with different partners across the ecosystem. If users of DiligenceVault, and again, my answers throughout and expressing here are relative to the private equity space, but if users of DiligenceVault are experiencing pain points with the ILPA DDQ, encourage you to reach out directly to myself. But then also, if you share that information with DiligenceVault, that's something where myself and interacting with Austin and his colleagues want to be able to understand at scale what are the various issues, one of the various pain points, because that also is an important piece of feedback to us when we think about potential updates. What are some of the customizations that are coming through? What are some of the data points that are most frequently left blank or most challenging? This is really a centralized area for us to be able to receive feedback in an even greater form. So really encourage users to share this feedback with DiligenceVault, and in turn, we interact with each other and want to be participating in understanding the feedback there. And also feel free to reach out directly if there are particular concerns or particular areas that you would like to talk about further.
And actually, I do see one question that maybe, James, you want to take a stab at, and if it's relevant for you at Arizona. The topic of AML, KYC screening, and ongoing monitoring, is that a concern for your group? Do you cover that in your DDQs? And if not, why?
Yeah, no, those are covered on both the ODD side from our consultants as well as from ourselves. I think our consultants do a comprehensive job in terms of covering many of these type of topics, and it is reviewed as well as addressed from our side as well. Maura.
Great. Okay. Thank you. And I think that's it, Austin. I think the others we can get answered in conclusion.
Yeah. Well, thank you all for joining today's webinar with DiligenceVault and Arizona PSPRS, ILPA, and Bostwick Capital. Really want to thank James and Neil specifically, and our moderator, Maura Harris, for sharing their experience and their views. We put up a poll about 5 minutes ago. Again, there were a few questions throughout today's webinar that we will put together in a takeaway packet. The content from these slides that you saw today, some of the questions, the panelists and moderators' bios will be available in this takeaways packet. And any questions that were not addressed, I see one that just came in with regards to following up with GPs on questionnaires. That is one of the values of using DiligenceVault, I will say, but we'll answer those and we'll make sure that the takeaways packet is comprehensive. We'll also provide the link to the recording, and we appreciate feedback throughout. So as Neil was mentioning, whether it's with respect to ILPA, DiligenceVault, whatever it is, or this webinar in particular, we'd love to hear suggestions. We put these webinars on just about monthly So we're very excited about the upcoming topics and are very grateful for all of your attendance. And again, thank you, James, Neil, and Maura for joining us today on the anatomy of a DDQ.
Thanks so much.
We will now close the session. Thanks so much.
Great, thank you.